Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. I'm your host, Joana Freitas. Our guest tonight is Anthony Frangi, an award-winning media and communication strategist from Australia with more than 30 years experience. He currently manages the Pop-Up Radio Australia after having served as the general manager for the Fairfax Radio in Brisbane and the content director for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, also known as ABC. Mr. Frangi is also a regular speaker and trainer on natural disasters, including for the UN. And that's exactly where we're going to start, natural disasters. Mr. Anthony, thank you so much for being with us on the show. I would like to start with maybe a hard question for anyone to answer, really. Yes. What is what we call climate change?
I think climate change is different things for different people, depending where you live. It could be rising sea levels, it could be extraordinary heat, whether you live in a place like Australia, where we've experienced heat waves, extreme heat waves in the last couple of months, being our summer. It could be melting of the glaciers. It could be the fact that farming communities haven't had rain. It could be the complete opposite. It could be floodwaters and continued floodwaters. I think that's one of the challenges for a lot of us, is because it's so extreme and there's uncertainty, people are confused as to whether the change in weather in their environment is caused by climate change or not.
Mm-hmm. And is there also confusion between climate change and pollution? When we talk about these topics, are they the same discussion or different discussions?
They can be the same and they can be different, depending how you tackle it. You have scientists on one note who are very factual because of the evidence that they share that climate change is real, and they share the data. And some of that data can be confusing to so many of us because in some regions, winters are getting colder. And we don't understand that, but the scientists are able to explain the reasons why. Temperatures, as we know, in the seas are rising. So it's interesting to hear their points of view and the reasons why climate change is very real today. And then I guess from a consumer point of view, we see around us so much is happening in terms of fossil fuels continuing to rise. We know that polluting our waterways is continuing, and we're seeing the consequences of that. So I think they do go hand in hand, but at the same time, I'm not sure if there's a direct parallel, but scientists would certainly be able to provide the insights into that.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about climate change, they're always the scientists always comes up, as well as the data and the facts and the numbers, which is very confusing for people. So, is there a moment where audiences are truly prepared to absorb the information about climate change? What is climate change and what can we do about it?
I'm not sure if they're truly prepared, but I think there comes a time when they start to question that climate change is real, and that usually happens in the event of a natural disaster. If there's an extreme heat wave that's prolonged for more than, say, 3 or 4 days, or if there's a cyclone or a typhoon that is at the highest of the category, and they start to realise or question whether climate change is causing these extreme weather changes. And at that point, I think we have a discussion, and it's a discussion with our family and our friends and our community, because we can really only see change in our region. We certainly can view overseas what's going on, but it's not until we start to see these changes or these effects in our own local region, we start to question whether or not it is due to climate change.
Mm-hmm. And is it possible to answer that question, though? We have the example of 2 years ago, Macau was hit by Typhoon Hato, a deadly typhoon, the first time in 50 years, the worst typhoon in 50 years. That was the headline, official headline, and what the media was using. So when we mention that a disaster is the worst in a certain number of years, are we doing it correctly, or should we maybe think, this is happening now, not because it's once in a lifetime, but maybe because it's related to this? How hard it is to link a disaster with climate change?
I think all we can really go on is history. If you talk to meteorologists, they base it all on data. They'll look at the history of the region, the history of storms, to look at the effects, and when we last had, say, a massive flood, or when we last saw a typhoon of the highest magnitude. So they look at history to base their facts on. And I guess there's a lot of uncertainty. And from a broadcast media perspective, it's really challenging for us to have those meaningful debates when there's still a lot of uncertainty about what climate change and the impact it's going to have on us, say 20, 30 years. We know that there are plenty of predictions. Scientists continue and remind us about dire predictions and whether or not 2040 is going to be a turning point. Some predict that the next 12 years is crucial for us to make change or else suffer the consequences. So it really depends on who we're talking to in the broadcast environment that then ultimately warrants further discussion. And it's hard, it's really hard because it's so complex. I mean, I describe climate change as having no barriers. There are no borders. So we can't blame a particular country or we can't blame a government for causing it. It's global. We're starting to see those changes, and therefore the discussion, whatever the consequences, always falls back onto the global consequences, not just in our region.
Global. That's one of the key words about we talk about the global warming. We talk about the everything regarding climate change is seen as global, but is there actually an error that maybe we all commit when we look at it is, oh, it's happening somewhere else in the world and not in our country, not in our region. So what are examples of what we do and what we have happening to our daily routine that contribute to climate change?
Well, it's a good point you make, because you only have to go on social media daily to look at people's arguments about how we live and how generous many of our lifestyles are today. Many families have more than one car. And so therefore the emissions of carbon dioxide, as we know, is certainly high. We know that consuming electricity and using air conditioners continues to grow. I was reading a report only recently that shows that we're going to be reaching 5, if not 6 billion air conditioners worldwide. So we're cooling ourselves, but at the same time we seem to be
warming up the world.
Heating the world. So there's another question, is how much of that is contributing to climate change? And so I think the big question, and this is one of the big challenges for us in the media, is how do you approach it when you know that ultimately change is inevitable, the way that we live? And everyone's very comfortable in how they've been living up until now. I mean, who wants to turn an air conditioner off when there's extreme heat? Who wants to walk to work when they can drive? Those changes, although they're small, could contribute to prolonging the effects of climate change. But it takes a very bold government or a media organisation to make those demands direct to the community, because while some of us are doing it already, others would probably find it very challenging in the way that they live.
You mentioned the having like a disruption in our routine, in what we have, our resources. I recall a drought happening, and that was the point of where people thought, okay, we need to save water, we need to think about this. So do we need to get a bigger disaster that is close to our home and closer to our normal routine for people to see that we actually need to change, that climate change is affecting all of us?
I hope we don't get bigger disasters to make us stop and think. But what's interesting about that, certainly in my country, Australia, whenever we have a Category 5 cyclone, typhoon, or major bushfires or extreme heat waves, it always brings up the topic of climate change. And I think that's how people view climate change today. It's about the weather because it affects them directly. And this is one of the big challenges for, I believe, media reporting, is it's difficult to talk about climate change and the effects if it's happening on the other side of the world. But what warrants a strong report, and perhaps a report that is first in line in terms of priority, is when something the magnitude of a bushfire or a typhoon that's flooding a community makes a major news story and affects a community. But there's also the question of when you're in recovery after a major event, how soon before you bring up climate change? Because as media organisations, we have a responsibility to look after our community, to ensure the safety and that the messages from the agencies and the government are shared with those people so that people make valued decisions about should they stay, should they evacuate, where are the danger points, how soon before the power is restored, how safe is our water. All of those day-to-day things we take for granted can be disrupted during a major disaster. And so we have to be careful when we're reporting that we don't then throw in a question about, well, is all of this because of climate change? Because we're still in recovery mode. And so we have to, I guess, from an editorial point of view, question that and ask ourselves, well, is there an appropriate time to talk about climate change? Is it a week after? Is it 2 weeks after?
Is there?
Should we? Well, I think we should be talking about it all the time, but in conversation. And in conversation so that we're not just addressing it at points of the year when there's a disaster. And we should be exploring it in ways, as we are with this show, is that we're talking about it at a time when there are no typhoons. But we're raising the level of interest to get people thinking about climate change, its effects, what they can do in their community, what's happening around the world, and what impact they might be making in their own small world, and what difference that they can make as well.
You're a trainer for media on these issues, so the way the matter is addressed by us, by the media, by people that report the news every day, is it not the most correct? So when we think about climate change, we think about what you mentioned, the ice melting, the sea rising, but there's something else there. So the way we are reporting is not the most correct that we could have been doing. When
we report, we often go direct to sources that are easily accessible. They are, say, scientists, academics who make themselves approachable to media. And they do that for good reason, because they have the data, they have the research, and they have the connections. So they give us a good understanding of where things are at the moment from a local or from a global perspective. But often I think what happens in this situation is that a lot of reporters, not all, but some reporters believe that they have to take on the role of being an expert, and therefore they express their own views, or they analyse the data in a way that is misinterpreted. And if you misinterpret that data, then there's the possibility of misrepresenting the facts. And therefore, if you do that, then audiences, ultimately, if they find out, then don't trust you anymore. And then they question just how authentic the data is and whether climate change is in fact happening. So I think as media professionals, we have a responsibility, yes, to source the facts, but also to look at the human side and the impact that it's having on everyday people. Because you're right, we're not confronted by scientists. We don't talk to scientists. Most of us don't talk to scientists every day. Some of us can't even analyse or understand the data that's come through, because it's very, very, very complex. But what we can do is take that data and look at it and go, well, how is this impacting us? How is this impacting us on an everyday level? And what can we do to share that information in a way that people can understand? You were mentioning how people, if we misinterpret data, people might think that we are doing it on purpose, that we are trying to mislead them. And we already still have a lot of skepticism about climate change. So we talked about this before, and you mentioned that we do not need a denier to balance this. We, as journalists, we always have that, okay, we need someone from one side and the other perspective from one side. Why do you say, and how do you say that we do not need a denier to balance this discussion on climate change? Look, it's a good question. If you had asked me that, say, 5 years ago, I would have said, yes, we need to have the deniers as part of a program. But if you look at everything that's being published today, and not just the data, but how people are perceiving that information, you'll find that a majority of the population accept that global change or climate change is real. So I don't think we need to have that argument anymore. We've had that argument, and we understand that it's real. And so by having the deniers there, all we're doing is prolonging what I believe is ultimately what's going to happen. They can be part of a conversation, but not necessarily, I think, focused on a program ultimately about the deniers. We as media professionals should always be skeptic. We should always be skeptic. We should be asking questions all the time. What does this mean? What impact does it have? Where did this data come from? You know, is it likely to impact our region because this data comes from the other side of the world? You know, is it truly global? I mean, all of those questions that viewers and listeners will want to know themselves the answers to. And I think that's really, really important. But from a denier's point of view, the skeptics or deniers will always be there, but their followers are not big at all.
So they're decreasing, you think?
Yeah, I think so. You know, they have a place, and I don't question that at all. There's a place for them, but if you look at what's being published today, credible scientific evidence and the views from the general community is that it's real, and you can't deny it because of what's going on around the world.
We often try to put the blame on someone or something, not only for climate change, for everything really, but for climate change, well, oh, this is our fault because we are consuming much, or this is the government's fault, or this is the industry, industry fault. So corporations, government, people, we are all to blame. Is that correct? We are all part of it. So are there solutions, and where are they?
Well, look, it's a good question. I think as reporters, it's our job to question all of that daily, and to find representatives, people from corporations and from government and from environmental groups, and rally them and talk to them and ask them those questions about what are you doing, what are corporations doing, what impact do they have on climate change, asking governments what are they doing to help reduce the effects of climate change. I don't think we can just target one organisation and poke the blame at them. Our job, as I believe, as reporters, as media organisations, is to bring all of that information together and provide what are the facts and let viewers make up their own mind about where change ultimately should start.
And if there was a solution, we already would know which one.
I think so. I mean, if I knew what the solution was, then I'd be telling you, and ultimately you'd be telling everybody else. It's incredibly complex. You know, having spent 3 days in Macau, sharing my understanding and knowledge of climate change. I mean, we don't have the answers, but all we can really do is start a conversation, and all we can do is look at the effects that are happening not only here but around the world. Start to look at the data, look at how people are talking openly about climate change, what's scaring people. You know, what is our approach? There appears to be a big turn-off whenever we frighten people. The doom and gloom approach, they tell us, is not the best approach when addressing climate change. So how best do we do that? And I think the storytelling element is important, to bring the stories to life so that people can relate directly to a fisherman who can no longer fish in a region that he's been doing for some time, or the effects of rising sea levels where, you know, land is being lost. It's not just about the data, but taking that data and turning it into a story so that you and I can relate to it.
A human story.
A human story. I think that's important. It's not being lost, but I don't think it's being told enough. And if we can tell more stories, then I think this movement of climate change and us better understanding its effects, I think will be much more beneficial to all of us.
We have you were here for 3 days. You mentioned that as a trainer for a workshop lecture about climate change, where TDM was also part of. When we talk about the solutions, we try together to find what can we do about it. And something just occurred to me, not only in climate change, but also in environmental protection. People that worry sometimes are seen as annoying, let's put it this way. Sometimes they're accused of, oh, you only worry about that because you're making a fashion statement. if you become vegetarian. If you worry about plastics and straws, it's because it's a trend. So people are accused of been following a fashion statement and got a lot of eye rolling sometimes. So do you really think that can't we use that fashion statement, even if it is, to actually make the world a better place?
I think we can, because those people, for example, in fashion, have a lot of followers. And if they can make a statement about climate change, a story that they can share, something personal, and they share that on social media and it reaches 10, 20, 30,000 followers, then ultimately I think that's a good thing, because it starts a conversation. It gets us thinking. We may not do anything as a result. We may not necessarily support what they're saying, but I believe that our role in the industry is to ignite a conversation and keep it alive, so that more people can contribute, more stories can be shared, more debates, more arguments can be had. It should never be the voice of one person. Our role should be to bring as many people together so that we can share the disappointment, share the hope, what's the stories that people are doing. If someone's making even the smallest of a difference to their life, and we know that that is a good thing, then I want to talk about that. It's not going to change the world, and it may not necessarily, well, it won't stop climate change from what we understand. But if that movement then grows and more people talk about it, let's say in 5 or another 10 years, who knows where we're going to be. I mean, I'm surprised. In fact, it delights me to have this conversation, because I think 5 years ago we would never have had this. 5 years ago, we weren't talking much about climate change. We were reporting it in the news, but only when there was a natural disaster. So we would probably say, and in the United States, there was a hurricane, and people believe the intensity of it is caused by climate change, and that'd be the end of the story. But here we are 5 years on, and it's no longer targeted to just a niche market. That mainstream media are openly talking about climate change. And I think that's a terrific thing, that we're having this healthy, open debate about it. And it's good for us in our industry, because we feel as though that our broad audience are accepting to the fact that we can talk about it, and they're not going to switch off or believe that it's a niche, it's only for the highbrow who truly understand what it's about.
So this conversation that has been more daily, like you are mentioning, but there's a small problem. You also have mentioned that, which is it's all doom and gloom, to quote you, when we talk about climate change. But you also mentioned that there has to be a beacon of hope. So there has to be something. Climate change is bad, but we're still on time to change this. And there are also good news about it. So let's talk about the good news on climate change.
Let's do it.
What are those?
Well, it's great when you come across a story from someone who is doing or wanting to put a positive point of view to climate change. I came across a wonderful story only the other day. It's in Singapore. In fact, I shared this in the workshop, where they're encouraging young people to share their stories about the changes they're making. And as simple as they are, there was a story of a young person, a teenager, who decided to cycle more. So he wanted to share that with his friends. I've ditched the car, I'm cycling more. And there was another story from a young lady who is asking and reminding all her friends to set the air conditioner to 25 degrees, not 16 or 17 or 18, to make a difference. And it's those stories that you start to see them resonating with their friends. And you see the retweets and you see the sharing, and all of a sudden their story is being read by so many other people. And they're the good stories. I remember in my town, they've just recently banned plastic bags. And so to turn that into a positive, there were stories from the locals about how to create shopping bags from old T-shirts. And so they were making videos about how to stitch and how to create these so you can take them shopping, so you no longer use plastic bags. Straws have been banned. Well, I don't know if they've been banned, but they're being removed from more and more cafes around the world and limited. So we're starting to see people create different types of straws out of bamboo and out of metal, and those stories seem to sort of resonate with the community. And although they're not directly related to climate change from a scientific point of view, it's the storytelling approach which at least is keeping those conversations alive. And that's a terrific thing. And then we in the media pick up on some of those social trends, and whether it's fashion or whether it's about someone who's decided to be a vegetarian, whatever the situation might be, rightly or wrongly, I don't think it matters. Well, I think what matters is that we keep this topic alive, and that's important for us.
2020.
Yes.
The year 2020 will be here soon.
Yes.
Next year. That was one of the dates set by the UN. Mr. Antonio Guterres, also the head of UN, also mentioned it as the date for the change that we desperately need. Do you think we will be able to get to the targets of, okay, we're actually doing something to reverse this, and 2020 looks so close now. So what's your beacon of hope for our...
Our beacon of hope. I can only hope myself. The part that I play, which is the sharing of knowledge and to find ways, creative ways that we as reporters and journalists can spread the word, can only be a good thing. I'd like to think that if I were a president or a prime minister, what difference would I truly make? But I don't have aspirations to be a prime minister or a president. But I think that we in the media can make a difference. I truly do. And despite all that doom and gloom, and that continues, you only have to look at some of the newspaper reports and vision from around the world, and they have their reasons for doing that, because some of it is very, very, very serious. But I also think that it's amazing what 12 months can do. And this time last year, I don't think we were talking as much about climate change, and here we are 12 months on. So in another 12 months, where will we be? And I can only hope that beacon is well lit, and that the more we talk about it, the more conversations we have, the more opportunity, and the stronger the movement. And maybe that movement will get so powerful that change will be inevitable, because we're calling for it. The majority of people finally understand what it is that's going on. And who knows? But one can only hope.
Let's hope, and let's keep the discussion alive. And thank you so much for your input. So that's all the time we got for tonight. We will be back next week with more TDM Talk Show.